In the heart of the kingdom, nestled between rolling hills and vast emerald forests, stood a grand palace. Its towers reached towards the sky, glittering like diamonds under the sun. The kingdom, known for its vibrant markets and stunning landscapes, was a place of peace and prosperity. The people adored their king, a wise and just ruler, known for his compassion and ability to maintain harmony among the various factions of the land. The royal family, revered by the masses, was seen as the epitome of grace and dignity. Their wealth was evident in the intricate tapestries that adorned the walls of the palace, the golden statues in the courtyards, and the lavish feasts held in their honor. Yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect kingdom, there was a growing unease, an undercurrent of tension that no one dared to speak of. The king, despite his wisdom and kindness, had fallen prey to the charms of his new queen, the stepmother of the princess. This woman, with her beauty and sharp intellect, had woven her way into the king's heart and mind, gaining not only his love, but also his trust. To the outside world, the king's new marriage was seen as a symbol of hope and renewal, but in the shadows, there was a more sinister story unfolding. The queen's influence over the king grew with each passing day, and her grip on the palace seemed unbreakable. While the people sang the king's praises, they whispered in secret about the queen's true nature, and it was clear to many that something dark was beginning to take root in the heart of the palace. The princess, the king's only daughter, was a beauty like no other. Her porcelain skin glowed with innocence, and her long flowing hair shimmered like spun gold. But despite the outward perfection of her life, she felt a deep sense of isolation. While others marveled at her beauty, she found herself trapped in a gilded cage. Her stepmother, a woman of great ambition and cruelty, controlled her every move. The princess was no longer allowed to wander the palace gardens, to meet with the people, or to explore the world beyond the palace walls. She spent her days locked away, surrounded by guards and attendants, all under the watchful eye of her stepmother. The life of luxury, once a blessing, now felt like a curse. She longed for the freedom to choose her own path, to live without fear of the queen's manipulation. But she felt powerless, a mere pawn in a game she didn't understand. In her quiet moments, the princess would sit by her window and gaze out at the sprawling kingdom below, imagining a life beyond the palace. She dreamed of running barefoot through the fields, of dancing in the open air, of meeting someone who would see her for who she truly was, not just as the daughter of a king. But these dreams always seemed out of reach, as if they were the fantasies of someone trapped in a world of shadows. She wondered if she would ever have the strength to break free, or if she would be forced to live her life in the prison her stepmother had built for her. The queen, her stepmother, was a woman who possessed both beauty and cunning. She had entered the royal family not by birthright, but by strategy, marrying the king after the tragic death of his first wife. At first, she had appeared to be the perfect match for the king, gracious, intelligent, and poised. The people welcomed her with open arms, and the king seemed to be utterly captivated by her. But beneath her charming exterior lay a woman driven by ambition and a ruthless desire for power. The queen believed that the throne rightfully belonged to her, and that her daughter, a child she had born in another land, should one day sit upon it. Her manipulation of the king was subtle yet effective. She whispered words of doubt into his ear, telling him that his daughter was weak and incapable of ruling. She made sure that the princess's every action was scrutinized, framing her as a naive, rebellious child who needed to be controlled for the good of the kingdom. Over time, she had convinced the king that the princess was a liability that needed to be removed for the sake of their legacy. But the queen had one more plan in mind, a plan to solidify her power by marrying off the princess to a wealthy nobleman, a man who would never question the queen's authority. This, she believed, would ensure her complete control over the kingdom. The queen had come from humble beginnings, but her sharp mind and beauty had made her rise quickly through the ranks. She had charmed her way into the heart of a widowed king, and once she was crowned queen, she made it her mission to secure her place as the true ruler of the kingdom. She was clever, manipulative, and knew exactly how to play the game of power. Her rise to the throne had been nothing short of calculated, and now that she had the king's ear, she intended to keep it that way, no matter the cost. The princess, in her eyes, was a mere obstacle standing between her and ultimate power. But the queen was about to learn that even the most carefully laid plans could unravel when fate intervened. The stepmother had long been calculating her next move. She had already secured her influence over the king, but now she aimed to solidify her grip on the entire kingdom. Her latest plan was simple, yet cruelly effective. Marry the princess off to a wealthy and influential nobleman. This nobleman, an aging lord with vast lands and immense political power, would be a perfect match for the princess, or so she claimed. To the outside world, it would appear as a match made in heaven, a union that would bring peace and stability to the kingdom. But to the queen, it was nothing more than a way to bind the princess to her control and remove any threats to her own power. The queen played her role to perfection, carefully presenting the idea to the king as if it were the kingdom's salvation. She spoke of alliances, of strengthening ties with powerful families, and of securing the future of the kingdom. The king, always concerned about the kingdom's well-being, listened intently. He trusted his wife's judgment, believing that she always acted in the kingdom's best interest. The queen's sweet words and well-placed arguments clouded his better judgment, and soon he was convinced that this marriage was the only way forward. But for the princess, the idea of being married off to an elderly nobleman was a nightmare. She had spent her life within the confines of the palace, but her dreams of freedom had kept her alive. She imagined a future where she could choose her own path, live without fear, and find love in her own way. The prospect of being married off to a man she did not love, and perhaps even feared, was a blow to all her hopes. She felt as though she were losing herself, her freedom, her dreams, all for the sake of her stepmother's ambition. The princess found herself alone in her chambers one evening, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The girl looking back at her was a stranger, her eyes filled with sadness and resignation. She had always been taught to be obedient, to fulfill her duties as a princess. But now she questioned everything. The thought of marrying the nobleman filled her with dread. How could she go on living like this? How could she be forced to marry someone she didn't know, someone who had no love for her, someone who only sought her as a pawn in the stepmother's game? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, determined not to let anyone see her vulnerability. She felt trapped, cornered by the very people who were supposed to care for her. It was during these dark moments that the princess began to notice subtle signs that her stepmother's plan was already in motion. There were whispers in the corridors, servants with nervous glances, and a growing sense of urgency in the air. The stepmother was tightening her grip, and soon the princess would be nothing more than a bargaining chip. The princess's heart raced as she pieced the clues together. She had no proof, no concrete evidence, but everything pointed to the fact that she was being forced into a marriage she could not escape. She tried to speak to the king, to plead for her freedom, but every time she found the courage to approach him, the queen was there, her presence suffocating, ensuring that no one spoke against her. The princess began to feel a sense of isolation that she had never experienced before. Even within the palace, surrounded by servants and guards, she felt completely alone. She could no longer trust the people around her, and the few friends she had left were too afraid to speak up. It was as if she were a prisoner in her own home, and the bars of her cage were closing in tighter each day. Her heart longed for escape, for someone to see her pain and help her break free. But who could she turn to? Who could understand the desperate situation she found herself in? Just as the princess's world seemed to be crumbling, A glimmer of hope appeared in the form of a prince. The kingdom had been in talks with a neighboring kingdom for years, and now the prince had come to visit for diplomatic purposes. His arrival was seen as a major event, and the court buzzed with excitement. The prince was everything the princess had ever dreamed of: noble, brave, and, most importantly, compassionate. He carried himself with an air of confidence that commanded respect, but it was the warmth in his eyes that made him stand out. Unlike the cold, calculating men the princess had known, the prince seemed to understand the world beyond politics and power. Their first meeting was brief but impactful. The princess was introduced to the prince at a royal banquet, and there was an immediate connection between them. The princess, cautious as always, tried to hide her emotions, but the prince could see through her facade. She tried to mask the sadness in her eyes, but it was impossible to ignore the deep sorrow that seemed to cloud her every movement. The prince, sensing her discomfort, took a moment to speak with her privately. He asked her how she was faring, and for the first time in a long while, the princess felt as though someone truly cared. Despite her initial hesitations, the princess felt a flicker of hope in her heart. She had never spoken to anyone like this before, and the prince's genuine concern for her well-being made her feel less alone. The bond between them began to form slowly, like a delicate thread connecting their hearts. The princess found herself looking forward to their next meeting, to the chance to speak with him again. But even as their connection grew, she couldn't shake the feeling that their time together was limited. The stepmother's plans were already in motion, and the princess knew that the prince's presence might not be enough to change her fate. The prince, too, began to notice the princess's sadness. It was hard to ignore the quiet despair that seemed to hang around her, and he couldn't help but feel protective of her. He knew little of the politics of the palace, but something was clearly wrong. He began to ask around, trying to learn more about the princess's situation without overstepping. He couldn't yet put his finger on it, but he felt that there was something dark lurking beneath the surface. He was determined to uncover the truth, but he also knew that he had to be careful. The palace was a place of power struggles and hidden agendas, and the prince was not sure whom he could trust. As the days passed, the prince's feelings for the princess grew stronger. He admired her strength, despite the pain she was enduring, and he found himself drawn to her like a moth to a flame. But there was a part of him that held back, unsure of how to navigate the politics of the palace. He was a prince, and his actions had consequences. But the more time he spent with the princess, the more he realized that he couldn't stand by and watch her suffer. Something had to be done, and he was determined to find a way to help her, even if it meant risking everything. The pressure within the palace grew unbearable as the day of the arranged wedding drew closer. The stepmother's plans, now in full motion, had little room for deviation. She pushed the king to finalize the details of the wedding, eager to cement her control over the kingdom once the princess was married off. She had already arranged for the princess to meet with the old nobleman in private, a meeting that would make the marriage appear as nothing more than a formality. To the world, it would seem like a perfectly logical union, one that would benefit the kingdom. To the princess, it was the culmination of her worst nightmare. As the day neared, the princess's heart grew heavier. She felt as if she were being suffocated, trapped in a gilded cage with no way out. The people in the palace treated her with forced politeness, offering no comfort or solace. Her father, the king, seemed blissfully unaware of her pain, his focus solely on the kingdom's well-being and the political alliances that would come with the marriage. The princess tried to speak to him, to express her dread, but every time she did, the stepmother was there, subtly guiding the conversation back to the benefits of the marriage. Her words were poison, disguised as concern. The princess's heart ached as she thought of her once loving father, now under the stepmother's sway. She had always been his little girl, but now she was nothing more than a tool in his eyes, a means to an end. The thought of marrying the old nobleman, of losing her freedom forever, filled her with despair. She had no hope left, or so she thought. Every moment she spent in the palace, under the watchful eye of her stepmother, felt like a countdown to her future, one she did not want. But the prince, having grown increasingly concerned about the princess's well-being, was not ready to stand by and watch her be dragged into a loveless marriage. He had spent more time with her, and with each passing day, his feelings for her deepened. He could see the sadness in her eyes, the weight of the world on her shoulders, and he could no longer ignore the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, the prince decided to take matters into his own hands. He sought out the king, knowing that the time had come to speak out. The prince, usually so diplomatic and careful with his words, spoke with urgency as he presented his concerns. He told the king of his suspicions about the stepmother's true intentions, that this marriage was not just a political move, but a carefully orchestrated plan to solidify her power and rid herself of the princess. The king, however, dismissed the prince's words. He trusted his wife implicitly, and he believed that this marriage was in the best interest of the kingdom. He told the prince that the princess's marriage was a necessary sacrifice, one that would bring peace and prosperity to their land. The prince's heart sank as he realized the depth of the king's blindness. The king could not, or would not, see the danger that the princess was in. Frustrated but determined, the prince decided that he would not let the princess face this fate alone. He knew that he could not confront the king any longer, but he could protect the princess in other ways. He began his own investigation, seeking out the truth about the stepmother's plans. It didn't take long for the prince to uncover the full extent of her cruelty. The old nobleman, whom the princess was to marry, was a means to an end. The stepmother had no intention of allowing the marriage to happen peacefully. After the wedding, she planned to have the princess killed, ensuring that her grip on the throne remained unchallenged. The prince was horrified by what he had discovered. He knew that time was running out. The wedding was only days away, and he had to act quickly. He began making plans to expose the stepmother's treachery, but he knew that he could not do it alone. He would need the princess's help, but first, he had to find a way to get her to trust him completely. Meanwhile, the princess, overwhelmed by the mounting pressure, began to doubt herself. Her love for her father and her loyalty to him had always been unwavering. She could not imagine a life without his love and guidance. But with each passing day, she grew more certain that the king was no longer the man she had once known. He was lost in the web of lies spun by the stepmother, and the princess was beginning to realize that her survival and the survival of her kingdom lay in her own hands. The princess had always been a dutiful daughter, but she had also been a girl with dreams of freedom, of love, and of a life outside the palace walls. Those dreams had been crushed by her stepmother's manipulations, but they were not completely gone. A small spark of hope remained, one that flickered whenever she saw the prince. She knew that he cared for her, and the warmth of his gaze gave her courage. The princess found herself torn between two worlds. On one hand, she loved her father with all her heart and could not bear the thought of betraying him. On the other hand, she saw the prince as a beacon of hope in a world that had grown cold and cruel. She had to make a choice, but the choice was not an easy one. Her emotions were a tangled mess: love for her father, fear for her own future, and the blossoming feelings she had for the prince. In quiet moments, the princess and the prince shared brief but meaningful exchanges. They would steal glances across the crowded hall, share soft smiles when no one was watching, and speak in hushed tones when they found a moment alone. The princess had never known someone who truly understood her the way the prince did. His compassion and care had given her something she had longed for: hope. But with the wedding so close, she was unsure how much time they had. Would she have enough time to trust the prince completely? Would he be able to help her before it was too late? The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her heart as she grappled with the fear of making the wrong choice, knowing that whatever path she took, it would change her life forever. The moment of truth arrived with a final, damning revelation. The prince, having gathered all the evidence he could on the stepmother's dark schemes, confronted the king in the royal chambers. He laid bare the full extent of her manipulation and treachery, presenting the evidence of her plan to marry the princess off to the old nobleman with the sole intention of having her killed. It was a cold, calculated conspiracy, one that had been playing out right under the king's nose for far too long. The moment the king saw the evidence, his face drained of colour, the shock in his eyes unmistakable. He had been blind, too trusting, and now in front of him, the truth was undeniable. The princess, standing nearby, had no idea what was happening until the prince turned to her with a pained look, urging her to stay calm. The weight of his words hit her like a hammer. Her mother had always told her that trust was the foundation of any relationship, and she had placed all her trust in her father. But now, everything she had ever believed in felt like it was crumbling to dust. Her heart shattered as the truth sank in. The one person she had loved and trusted more than anyone, her own father, had been manipulated by the very woman who had claimed to care for her. She thought back to all those moments when the king had stood by her, offering his words of comfort, and realized that the stepmother's influence had twisted those moments into something far darker than she could have ever imagined. The princess collapsed, tears streaming down her face as she whispered in disbelief, "How could you? How could you betray me like this?" The king stood in stunned silence, the weight of his mistakes suffocating him. For the first time, he truly saw his queen for who she was, and the guilt of allowing her to destroy his daughter's life washed over him like a torrent. But the damage was done. The princess, broken and disillusioned, had lost everything she once held dear, and the betrayal ran deeper than anyone could have expected. As the tension in the room thickened, the prince stepped forward, taking the princess's trembling hand in his own. He stood beside her, silently vowing to protect her from any harm. The king, still reeling from the shock, had no idea how to respond, but he knew something had to be done to prevent further devastation. The stepmother, who had been lurking nearby, realized the jig was up. Panic flashed in her eyes as she turned to flee, but before she could take another step, the prince's guards blocked the door. There was nowhere left to run. She turned, her eyes blazing with fury as she confronted the prince and the princess, her voice cold with venom. "You think you've won? You think the kingdom belongs to you?" she hissed. "You are weak, both of you. This was always meant to be mine. The throne is mine, and nothing will stop me from claiming it." The prince stepped forward, his expression resolute. "No, it was never yours," he said calmly, but with conviction. "Your plan ends here, and you will be held accountable for your crimes." He motioned to the guards, who closed in, but the stepmother resisted, throwing herself into a wild fit of rage. "You think I will be exiled, cast aside like some common criminal?" she screamed. "I deserve to rule. The princess is nothing compared to me. She doesn't deserve this kingdom." But the prince's gaze never wavered, his resolve as solid as steel. "Your power is built on lies and manipulation. It ends now." As the guards closed in on her, she struggled with all her might, but she was no match for the prince's authority. Her screams of defiance echoed through the palace halls as she was dragged away. The moment she had dreamed of, the moment she would finally ascend to power, had slipped through her fingers like sand. But as she was taken away, a new revelation emerged, one that shocked everyone in the room. The king, his face pale, his voice unsteady, finally spoke. "There's more," he muttered, his voice shaking. The princess turned toward him, her confusion mirrored in the prince's eyes. The king's confession was a thunderbolt. I never suspected it, but she poisoned me. Slowly, over the years. I thought it was just my health deteriorating, but she was the one behind it all, weakening me bit by bit so she could take control." He looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. I trusted her. I trusted her to protect you, my daughter. But instead, she planned to murder you, and now I see that she was trying to take my life too, all for the throne." The words hit the princess like a crushing wave, drowning her in disbelief and sorrow. Her father, the king, had been poisoned by the very woman he had trusted most. The man who had once been her protector had been reduced to a mere puppet in the stepmother's cruel game. And now, the full scale of her malice was clear to everyone in the kingdom. The prince, ever watchful, stepped forward to support the king, whose hands were trembling. "We have to act swiftly," he said. "The stepmother must be exiled and banished from the kingdom. She will never threaten your family again." The king, broken by the weight of the truth, nodded weakly, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he had failed the ones he loved most. "Exile her," he whispered. "She will never step foot in this kingdom again." With that, the stepmother's fate was sealed. The once powerful queen, who had so masterfully manipulated her way to the throne, was now nothing more than a shadow of her former self, exiled from the kingdom and cast into oblivion. The palace, once a place of treachery and deceit, was now a place of fragile hope and healing. The prince stood by the princess, watching as the final remnants of the stepmother's power slipped away. The kingdom, though shaken by the truth, would rebuild, stronger and wiser. And for the princess, though the road ahead was uncertain, the dawn of a new chapter was just beginning. After the tumultuous storm of deceit and betrayal, the princess stood tall, no longer weighed down by the oppressive shadow of her stepmother. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of freedom, as though the chains that had bound her were finally broken. Her father, the king, was filled with deep regret as he looked at her. "I failed you, my daughter," he said, his voice laced with sorrow. "I should have seen her for who she truly was, and I should have protected you." The princess took a moment, the pain of the past still fresh in her heart. But in that moment, she found it within herself to forgive him. "You were also deceived, father," she replied softly. "The stepmother knew how to manipulate us both, and I know you never meant for any of this to happen." With that understanding, a bridge of healing was built between father and daughter, one that would take time, but was necessary for the kingdom's future. The king's sorrow was not left unheeded, and the princess, with newfound wisdom, knew that forgiveness was the first step toward healing. She turned her focus to the future and began preparing herself to step into her rightful role as heir to the throne. The prince, who had been a steadfast ally throughout the ordeal, was finally recognized for his bravery. His courage in confronting the stepmother and exposing her treachery had saved the princess and the kingdom. The people celebrated him as a hero, and his name became synonymous with justice and righteousness. As for the princess, she felt a deep sense of empowerment. No longer the frightened young woman who had been a pawn in her stepmother's game, she had risen above her past and was ready to take control of her destiny. She stood on the threshold of a new chapter, one where she would lead the kingdom with strength, wisdom, and compassion. The future was hers, and she knew that she was capable of shaping it. With the dark cloud of the stepmother's treachery lifted, the kingdom entered a new era of peace and prosperity. The princess, now fully prepared to take on the mantle of leadership, began her reign with the prince by her side. Together, they worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been broken and to bring a sense of stability and hope to the people. Under her guidance, the kingdom flourished, and the people embraced her as their true queen. The announcement of the princess and prince's engagement was met with joyous celebration across the land. The marriage was not just a union of two hearts, but a symbol of the strength that had emerged from the darkness. The people knew that together, the princess and prince would lead them to a future of promise and peace. One evening, after a long day of meetings and decisions, the princess and the prince took a quiet moment for themselves. They stood together in the royal gardens, the moonlight casting a soft glow on their faces. As they looked out over the kingdom, the princess felt a profound sense of peace. "Do you ever wonder how we made it through all of this?" the princess asked softly, her voice filled with both awe and gratitude. The prince smiled, taking her hand in his. "We made it because we trusted each other, because we were brave enough to fight for what was right. And now we get to build something beautiful, together." The princess nodded, knowing that their love, trust, and bravery had brought them to this point. They had overcome the darkest of times, and now they were standing at the dawn of something far brighter. As the princess and prince prepared to lead the kingdom together, there was a renewed sense of hope and optimism for the future. The princess, no longer the frightened girl she once was, had blossomed into a confident, capable ruler, one who would inspire generations to come. With the prince by her side, they stood united, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that together they could conquer anything. The kingdom, once again bathed in the light of justice and love, was destined for greatness, and the story of the princess and prince would be told for years, a testament to courage, love, and redemption.